In the US-Israel-Iran war, everyone thinks the biggest loser is Iran. But one of the war's biggest losers is thousands of kilometers away, and not a single bomb fell on it. China. They're not even a party to this war. But the fortress economy that Xi Jinping marketed as indestructible for years is cracking. The US noticed this and is using it as a countermove. It's intercepting tankers headed to China. The US is cutting not just Iran's strait, but all of China's strategic sea bridges and routes. And if you think the US is only fighting Iran, you're wrong. China had already taken over Iran long before this war. And when Xi's devil's deal with the Iranian regime collapsed, China's entire system started shaking. The deal looked like a comprehensive strategic partnership with a $400 billion investment in Iran. In reality, it was a devilish plan through which China effectively took over Iran. Iran's mineral base, resources that the Tehran Chamber of Commerce valued at $27.3 trillion, was being developed with Chinese technical support. Chabahar and Jask ports, strategic exit gates built with Chinese investment, were going to be an exclusive oil export route to China bypassing Hormuz. CNPC was operating at the South Pars gas field. Chinese workers were building the railways. Huawei was setting up the telecom infrastructure. And Iran's shadow fleet tankers, 18% of global tanker capacity, were the conveyor belt carrying cheap oil to China. In short, Iran looked like an independent country, but behind the curtain, it was effectively China's colony. And then the US struck Iran in February 2026, and China's decade-long silent empire collapsed overnight. Discounts disappeared, margins went negative, China's hidden fuel ran out. And the shock didn't stay in oil alone. It spread across China's entire industrial floor. In Dongguan's plastic city, polyethylene surged 37% in a few weeks. Plastic costs in southern China rose 60%. Zhonghua Chemical declared force majeure. It couldn't guarantee safe shipping through Hormuz. Beijing completely banned fertilizer exports. Sulfuric acid is next. And the helium crisis hit chip production. Most supply comes from Qatar, and when war disrupted shipping, prices doubled. Half of global sulfur trade passes through Hormuz. Aluminum from Bahrain and Emirates Global Aluminium, the biggest producers outside China, took damage. Toyota, BMW, Hyundai can't find automotive-grade aluminum. Semiconductors, electric vehicles, AI, the sectors China bet its future on, all under pressure. And the US understands exactly this. China controlled Iran's ports, oil fields, and infrastructure. So closing Iran's sea exits means hitting China's assets. CENTCOM has turned back 34 ships so far. Where were most of them going? To China. The US Navy seized Iran-flagged Tuska by opening fire. And INDOPACOM, Indo-Pacific Command, is intercepting Iranian tankers in the Bay of Bengal, right next to Malacca. The Pentagon says it openly. The US military has global reach. International waters are not a sanctuary for sanctioned vessels, and the US isn't stopping at Hormuz. US destroyers are making contact with tankers leaving Chabahar port, the critical node of China's trade with Iran. P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft are hunting tankers. The US is imposing a blockade on Iran, but the real target is China's energy line. The ports, pipelines, export routes China built in Iran over a decade are now the targets of the US blockade. Every strike on Iran hit one of China's assets, and this won't be limited to Iran alone, because the US can use this capacity elsewhere too. The war's damage wasn't limited to energy lines alone. It also hit the global vision that Xi Jinping had been building for over a decade. Belt and Road, BRI, the backbone of China's global power projection. And one of the critical nodes of this network was Iran. The China-Iran railway was nearing completion in 2025. It would carry Iranian oil directly to China. It would reduce dependence on Hormuz. Israeli airstrikes largely destroyed the line. It turned to rubble without carrying a single cargo. China has invested more than $269 billion in the Middle East since 2005. $82 billion to Saudi Arabia, $48 billion to the UAE, $40 billion to Iraq, $25 billion to Iran. Ports, pipelines, highways, power plants, they were supposed to be trade safeguards for decades. The war turned these assets not into safeguards, but into points of vulnerability. Shipping narrowed, insurance soared, projects were postponed. Road and port projects in Iraq slowed due to security concerns. Energy partnerships in Saudi Arabia are being reassessed. And Iran's $25 billion are almost completely frozen. Chinese companies can't leave Iran because sanctions block them, but they can't stay either because project sites have been either bombed or made inaccessible. Hudson Institute analyst Miles Yu. China built its Middle East strategy on Iran. That bet lost. And a deeper problem with BRI has emerged. The countries China tied to itself by promising cheap energy and raw materials, from Pakistan to Indonesia, Africa to Central Asia, now can't get what they want from China. China banned its own fertilizer exports, restricted plastic supply, is stopping sulfuric acid. BRI countries trusted China's promise. Now those promises are falling flat. BRI's fundamental assumption was that economic connectivity could be insulated from geopolitics. The Iran war disproved this assumption, and land corridors turned out to be just as fragile as sea routes. This is an existential question for BRI. If China cuts its partners' resources to meet its own needs during a crisis, why should those partners trust China? The collapse of BRI is just the beginning. All these blows are connected, and each one triggers the next. Iranian oil was cut, energy prices surged, shipping costs rose, raw materials soared. Every product leaving factories carried extra cost. And the one thing China had been selling the world for over a decade, cheapness, suddenly began to melt. This domino effect is visible on the factory floor. Even before the war, a quarter of factories were already losing money, operating below 60% capacity. Cheap Iranian energy was barely keeping them alive. Now that support has collapsed, shift cuts are starting, overtime is being cancelled, seasonal workers are being sent back. And as the blockade continues, the domino grows. Factories could completely shut down, layoffs could accelerate, youth unemployment, already China's most sensitive social issue, could climb even higher. Xi's biggest fear: economic hardship turning into social unrest. International buyers are already moving. Orders are being cancelled. Production is shifting to Vietnam and India. This shift is not temporary. Once supply chains move, they don't come back. For years, China held countries under economic siege with cheap products. It eliminated alternatives, crushed local producers, created dependency. Now that fortress itself is under siege, and the irony is this: the country that used the fortress siege strategy is being destroyed by another siege. And now let's get to China's real nightmare. The US blockade of Iran is sending China a very clear message. We know how to close a strait. We can do it globally. And what we did to Iran, we can do to you. Nothing remains to make this message theoretical. Indo-PACOM intervened against Iranian tankers in the Bay of Bengal, right next to the Strait of Malacca. US naval bases are positioned at both ends of Malacca: Diego Garcia, Singapore, Japan, Guam. The Strait of Malacca, the narrow waterway through which 80% of China's oil imports pass. 30% of global trade flows through here. And the Hormuz crisis has started to shake Malacca too. Indonesia's finance minister, Purbaya Yudi Sadewa, asked this question at a Jakarta symposium. Iran charges fees for ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Why aren't we? If we split it between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, it would be significant revenue. Indonesia later stepped back. The foreign minister said, such a fee would not be appropriate. Singapore's foreign minister Balakrishnan responded firmly, the right of passage is guaranteed for everyone. We will not participate in any attempt to close or toll the strait. But the mere fact that this discussion started is an alarm for China, because what happened at Hormuz created a precedent. A strait can be closed, fees can be charged, passage can be blocked. Not just Iran, even Indonesia started thinking about it, and markets have already reacted. In March 2026, insurance premiums for ships passing through the Strait of Malacca jumped 18%, just because of toll rumors. Lloyd's of London issued a special warning to shipping firms. Hormuz hasn't yet concretely affected Malacca, but fear alone is creating billions of dollars in costs. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, warned that simultaneous pressure on both key choke points would create a double squeeze in global energy flows. a much heavier version of the scenario that triggered the 2022 oil price explosion. And the Iran war proved two things. First, the US naval blockade capacity is far broader than thought. Blockade at Hormuz, ship firing in Oman, tanker seizure in the Indian Ocean, interdiction in the Bay of Bengal, doing it all simultaneously. Second, land corridors are not safe either. The China-Iran railway was destroyed. CPEC was affected by the Hormuz chaos. And there's a third reality. The US can squeeze China without attacking it. The Hormuz blockade is directly aimed at Iran, but it's indirectly cutting China's energy supply. If US-China tensions ever explode over Taiwan, the US may not even need to close Malacca. It could cut China's oil at the source through a third-party blockade, like the Hormuz model. This is not an ordinary threat analysis for Beijing. This is a turning point, requiring China to recalculate its entire energy security, naval strategy, and global power projection. China's strategic planners are no longer thinking if, they're thinking when. A power dependent on a single strait can always be squeezed by the power that controls that strait. And China's heaviest reality is this: it has virtually no real cards against this crisis. Diplomacy? Beijing condemned the US blockade, but couldn't take any concrete step beyond a UN veto. And a UN condemnation doesn't pull back the US Navy. Russian energy? China is trying to buy more oil from Russia, but Russia has capacity limits. Pipeline capacity is restricted. Russian oil by sea also passes through straits, and no single source can cover the daily 1.4 million barrel Iranian gap. Naval forces? China's Navy has surpassed the US in ship count, but it's nowhere close to the US global superiority that controls multiple oceans simultaneously, and the US game is far more urgent. Retaliation? China could launch a trade war against the US, but a tariff war is already ongoing, and opening a second front while China's economy is reeling from the shock would be suicide. China is trapped. The US has cornered China with a single blockade move, without dropping a bomb. And China has no short-term tool to change this. This is helplessness, and Beijing knows it. China isn't quietly absorbing the shock and hiding it. It's transferring part of the pressure to the world. Fertilizer exports have been banned. Sulfuric acid will stop. These are not niche products. They are the building blocks of agriculture and industry. And the domino has already started. The Philippines declared a state of emergency due to fuel shortages. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Vietnam face serious supply shortages. Gujarat's ceramics industry shut down. Restaurants in Mumbai can't find cooking gas. 60% of India's LPG imports passed through Hormuz. Now it's turned to queues, delays, and emergency solutions. The IEA described this as the biggest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The OECD warned that global growth in 2026 could fall from 2.9% to 2.6%. When the world's largest manufacturing base is shaken, the waves reach everywhere. Not a single bomb fell on China, but it took one of the war's heaviest blows. Cheap oil is gone. Factories have slowed. Belt and Road took a hit. The cheap product strategy blunted. The fortress economy cracked. And the US proved it can cut all of China's strategic sea bridges and routes without dropping a bomb. China looked at its cards and saw that nearly all of them were empty. Today, Hormuz. Tomorrow, Malacca. And how China faces this reality will determine the power balances of the 21st century. Amid all this economic devastation and the waves of global shock, a very critical question comes to mind. Now, we've reached the truly critical point. Will China consider military options to break this blockade? Will it send warships? Beijing is facing very difficult dilemmas, and every option carries a very high price. First option? Test the US blockade with military force. Can the Chinese Navy send warships to Hormuz? In theory, yes. China has an overseas military base in Djibouti in East Africa. The PLA Navy has shown dramatic growth in the last decade, and its port network stretching from Morocco to Mozambique offers infrastructure ready for military operations. But Hormuz is a very different stage from Djibouti. Against US power at the strait, the Chinese Navy is at a serious disadvantage. 3 carrier strike groups, over 15 warships, continuous air patrols, satellite surveillance. Directly challenging this force means war, and China is not in a position to risk hot conflict with the US, especially during a period of ongoing Taiwan tensions. A Chinese warship forcing the blockade line would create a direct encounter between two nuclear powers at sea. Such a moment last occurred during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Second option, gray zone tactics. The method China has used for years in the South China Sea, showing presence with white-hulled Coast Guard ships and fishing militias instead of warships. Beijing could try sending commercial ships with Coast Guard escort, a non-military but deterrent convoy. The Chinese Navy could establish presence in the Gulf of Oman under the guise of maritime security operations, without directly breaking the US blockade, but making its presence felt. But the tactic that works in the South China Sea could produce different results here. They're not facing the Philippine Coast Guard, they're facing 3 US carrier strike groups. The risk calculus is entirely different. And if China sends a tanker convoy with military escort and the US stops it, Beijing's bluff is proven to the entire world. The multipolar world rhetoric falls flat. Third option, diplomatic and economic pressure. The UN Security Council veto card is in China's hand. It can block any UN resolution that would legitimize the US blockade. It can support Iran's conditional passage demands to build international opposition. And it can apply direct economic pressure on Washington, escalate the trade war, sell US treasuries, weaponize supply chains. But none of these opens the strait. Diplomatic maneuvers take time, and China's refineries are racing against time. Beijing has 130 days of strategic petroleum reserves, but consumption is accelerating without Iranian oil and with Hormuz partly closed. And every passing day forces reliance on alternative sources: Russia, Africa, Latin America, at higher prices. Fourth option, perhaps the most important, wait and seize opportunity. Beijing is doing exactly this right now. In March, it completely halted gasoline and diesel exports, squeezing Japan and South Korea, weakening its own regional rivals. It started buying US LNG, reopening imports it had cut during the trade war thanks to the crisis. It's supplying fuel to Southeast Asia to expand regional influence. The crisis is hurting China, but Beijing is managing to hurt its rivals even more while managing its own damage. Fifth option, build a permanent alternative network bypassing Hormuz. Gulf bypass routes through Pakistan's Gwadar port. Beijing had been building infrastructure for exactly this scenario for years. The crisis proved the strategic value of these investments. But these lines can't yet match Hormuz's capacity. Long-term solution, not short-term emergency. China can't militarily challenge the US. Gray zone tactics fall short at Hormuz. Diplomacy takes time. Wait and see works short-term, but reserves don't last forever. Beijing calculates but doesn't take risks. And this waiting is itself a message. Share in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated. Thank you for choosing us.